Have you ever wondered what someone is capable of when they believe no one is watching? When the masks fall and true character is put to the test. This story begins like that, in silence, with a powerful man pretending to sleep and a humble boy about to make a decision that would change his life forever. What you are about to discover may surprise you. In that immense mansion, where the sound of the wind seemed to echo among the antique furniture, the magnate rested in his dark leather armchair. Outwardly, he was a symbol of success, a man of means, owner of grand businesses, respected wherever he went. But inside, he hid something that money could never buy, the peace of trusting someone. He was a man surrounded by luxury, but suffocated by loneliness. After years of disappointments, he had learned to distrust even kindness, and it was this distrust that brought him to that decisive night. While pretending to sleep, his thoughts mingled with bitter memories. He had been betrayed by partners, deceived by people he trusted. Therefore, he now wanted to test the limits of human honesty. And the person he chose to test was not a businessman, but the son of the woman who cleaned his house, a simple boy who always greeted him with a sincere smile, even without receiving anything in return. The clock was almost midnight when it all began. The tycoon breathed slowly, trying to make his sleep convincing. Beside him on the mahogany table lay his wallet, open, full of large bills, deliberately displayed as a temptation. The dim light of the lamp cast shadows on the man's face, revealing features of someone carrying the weight of a lifetime of distrust. Stay with me until the end, because what this boy did in that instant will leave you speechless. Silence filled the air. Outside, only the rustling of the trees broke the stillness of the early morning. Then the door slowly opened, and light footsteps crossed the carpet. The boy paused for a second in the doorway, as if searching for courage within his own heart. The magnate, with half-closed eyes, watched, unnoticed. He wanted to see, or perhaps he wanted to have hope, that there were still pure, sincere people, capable of acting correctly even when life offers them a fleeting chance to change their destiny. The boy took a few more steps, and the sound of his heart seemed to fill the room. His eyes fixed on the open wallet, on the discreet gleam of the bills. For a moment his thoughts drifted away, perhaps to overdue bills, to his mother's tiredness, to the nights when dinner wasn't enough for the two of them. He swallowed hard. The conflict between need and conscience was visible. The tycoon, without moving a muscle, felt a tightness in his chest. At that moment, he didn't know what he expected to see, a gesture of weakness or a sign of enlightenment. Time seemed to have stopped. Each second carried an invisible weight. The boy moved even closer, and the air grew thick, almost suffocating. The tycoon felt a shiver run through his body, but remained motionless, attentive to every movement. And then it all happened. Something so unexpected, so sincere, that it made that man of stone question everything he believed about trust and kindness. But what the boy did in that instant left even the tycoon speechless. The tycoon remained motionless for a few seconds, trying to comprehend what he had just witnessed. That simple scene, full of humanity, stirred something he thought was forgotten within himself. Behind all the coldness he displayed, there was a man tired of protecting himself, someone who could no longer bear living surrounded by broken certainties. What the boy had just done completely disarmed him, and for the first time in many years, he felt the urge to believe in people again. His breathing became lighter, and a glimmer of emotion crossed his gaze, which had previously been so dry and distant. If this kind of story awakens something within you, if it somehow makes you think about what really matters when no one is watching, leave a comment below about what has touched you the most so far. Sometimes your perspective, your experience, can touch other people who are feeling the same way, and that's precisely what makes this community so special. Like the video, not only because it helps the channel grow, but because every gesture you make shows that it's worthwhile to continue telling stories that rekindle faith in humanity. And if you're not already part of our family here on the channel, subscribe and turn on notifications. That way you won't miss the next chapters of this and other stories about emotion, choices, and redemption. Your presence here is what allows this message to reach more hearts and perhaps transform the day of someone who needs to hear it right now. While the boy still stood there, unaware he was being watched, the tycoon struggled to hold back his own tears. He wanted to stand up, thank him, perhaps ask for forgiveness for having doubted. But he remained quiet, his heart racing, trying to understand how a simple act of kindness could reveal so much about a human being's character. And it was in this emotionally charged silence that something within him began, slowly, to change. Behind that stern gaze was a man who no longer trusted anyone. The tycoon lived surrounded by luxury, but that glamour always came at a silent cost, the price of becoming a prisoner of his own loneliness. Each valuable painting hanging on the walls of his mansion seemed to silently remind him that material success does not guarantee a warm heart. He had everything the world admired, but nothing that truly nourishes the soul. There was a time when he believed in people, in sincere promises, and in true bonds. At the beginning of his journey, he was a dreamer, willing to help anyone who crossed his path. He worked late, thinking about how to transform opportunities into something that would benefit not only himself, but those around him. But as the years passed, betrayals began to surface in sequence. Childhood friends who deceived him, partners who took advantage of his trust, loved ones who disappeared when money became the only link between them. These wounds, invisible to the naked eye, made him increasingly cold. From so much disappointment, he learned to build walls too high to allow any genuine connection. Inside his house, the silence was almost absolute. He liked to observe the reflection of the city lights through the glass windows, as if there were a life outside that he could no longer touch. He was a spectator of his own success, imprisoned between achievements and memories. Behind his impeccable routine, there was a pain no one saw. His employees treated him with respect, of course, perhaps even with fear. But respect and affection are different things, and he knew that. Respect can come from power, love, never. At each solitary dinner, the gleam of the silver cutlery seemed to mock the emptiness at the table. No conversation, no light laughter filled the space, only the sound of the clock marking the time that would never return. On some nights, the tycoon would retrieve old letters kept in a drawer, memories of a time when he still believed in human kindness. One of them was from his late wife, who always told him, "Don't lose faith in people, even when they prove you wrong." He read that phrase repeatedly, but nowadays the words seemed distant, almost naive. "Faith in people?" he repeated in his thoughts. "People only show up when they need something." It was his hidden truth, the one he never admitted aloud. But something inside him still fought against this cynicism. A fragment of humanity persisted, stubbornly, like an ember that insists on burning even in the rain. He wanted to believe that good still existed, that it was possible to find purity in a world corrupted by self-interest. And perhaps without realizing it, it was this almost extinguished hope that motivated him to test the boy that night. What the tycoon didn't realize was the impact that moment would have on his own mindset. In that silent instant, observing the unexpected behavior of the maid's son, something began to crumble within him. Not just distrust, but the entire emotional structure that kept him away from people. He felt shame. Shame for having judged a pure heart with the cold metric of his own pain. It was as if the mirror finally showed him who he had become, a respected but empty man, powerful but incapable of feeling. While trying to understand that turmoil, he remembered so many times he had looked at his employees without truly seeing them. They were anonymous faces that passed through his life, fulfilling duties, cleaning spaces, but never occupying any place in his story. He realized how far he had strayed from the simple reality of ordinary people, those who, suffering, still maintain a pure gaze, a naive faith, a sweetness that money cannot buy. It was curious to note how, even surrounded by everything he had ever wanted, he felt incomplete. Power had given him status, but it had also made him a prisoner of himself. Believing in someone seemed like something from another time, a naivete he could no longer afford. Yet that scene, so simple, so authentic, did the impossible. It cracked the wall of indifference he had built around his heart. Over the following days, the tycoon couldn't get the boy out of his head. That simple gesture haunted him like an echo of his conscience. Why would someone so young and living with so little refuse, the chance to earn in minutes what his mother would take months to save? This question tormented him not out of distrust, but out of admiration, and the more he thought about it, the more the memory humanized him. He began to see the world differently, reviewing decisions, recalling mistakes, wondering at what point he had traded the meaning of life for the weight of pride. There were times when the tycoon thought of giving up everything, selling his possessions, disappearing. But the pain of isolation is treacherous. It leaves no room for courage, only for regret. He didn't know it yet, but that boy would become the mirror of his redemption. A silent transformation was underway, an inner journey so profound that it would gradually change the course of his story. In the days that followed, Every detail of that night would return to his mind. The boy's calm gaze, the soft sound of his footsteps, the note left with its few words. It was as if fate had sent him a lesson wrapped in simplicity, and for the first time in a long time, the tycoon felt the desire to be better. He wanted to recover the man he once was, the one who believed that kindness is not weakness and that character is the true treasure. Dawn arrived with a different tone. The sun streamed through the mansion's curtains, touching the marble floor as if to warm that icy heart. In the air there was a new feeling, a timid but real beginning of change. The powerful man now seemed smaller in the face of the human value that had been revealed to him. And, even without knowing exactly what he would do next, he understood that something had been reborn within him. That same morning, as the sun streamed through the mansion windows and the tycoon struggled to comprehend the turmoil within him, life continued in another corner of the city, far removed from any luxury. There, in a small house with peeling walls and the aroma of brewed coffee, lived the woman who for years had cared for the details of her employer's home. She woke before dawn, even with a tired body and hands marked by a routine that had long since ceased to be light. She was a woman of few words, but with a discreet strength that time could not erase. Her gaze carried the weight of daily struggle, and her gestures the tenderness of someone who had learned to love life even when it seemed to offer so little. Her name was Rosa, a simple name, like her story. From a very young age, she learned to fend for herself. She worked in private homes, washed clothes, cleaned yards, and raised her son practically without anyone's help. Poverty accompanied her, but it never managed to steal her dignity. She used to say that whoever carries faith in their heart never walks barefoot, because God paves the way. It was her way of resisting, believing that even in scarcity there was purpose. Her son, Gabriel, was the reason for her tireless efforts. A boy with a gentle smile, a pure gaze, and dreams too big to fit into the reality they lived in. Little by little, he came to understand the value of small things, the smell of fresh bread baked by his mother, the tight hug at the end of a difficult day, the pride of seeing his clean uniform hanging on his chair. He studied when he could, helped with household chores, and whenever he had spare time, he read books he found in the neighborhood garbage dumps. He was curious, unlike most boys his age. While others talked about money and status, he talked about justice, about kindness, about the desire to change the world, starting from within. Rosa watched her son with a mixture of pride and worry. She knew the world was cruel to those who dreamed too much. Sometimes, while watching him sleep, tired from the day, she cried softly, afraid she wouldn't be able to secure a better future for him. And yet, there was always a glimmer of hope. In that simple home, surrounded by scarcity, pulsed a silent richness, faith. In the mansion where she worked, Rosa was respected, but invisible. People always saw her in the same apron, with the same discreet smile and the same attention to detail. But no one imagined how much she carried on her shoulders: the pain of social rejection, accumulated fatigue, anxiety for a tomorrow that never seemed to arrive. Even so, she never lost the word "thank you" from her lips. Gratitude was what kept her going. Gabriel used to wait for her to come home from work, sitting by the door, always with some news to tell her. He dreamed of studying engineering, building houses for those who had nowhere to live. He said that one day he would buy a house for his mother, with large windows and a yard full of flowers. Rosa smiled, pretending to believe that this was possible, but deep down, she doubted that fate would allow something so beautiful. Even so, she never destroyed that dream. She knew that without it, her son might lose his way. The relationship between the two was more than mother and son. They were partners on a journey. Each difficulty united them even more. And it was for him that Rosa endured everything. The long bus trips, the disdainful glances, the days when her body begged for rest, but life demanded movement. Every effort she made within that mansion was, in silence, a prayer of love. The tycoon, without realizing it, observed that woman every day. There was something in Rosa's demeanor that both bothered and inspired him. She didn't bow to luxury. She didn't envy what she would never have. It was as if her humility revealed, without words, the fragility of the power he so vehemently defended. Sometimes, when she left the room smelling clean or placed the coffee on the table with a touch of care, he felt a strange kind of peace, the kind that wealth had never given him. Gabriel, on the other hand, saw his mother's boss differently. For him, the tycoon was living proof that money could buy comfort, but not joy. He liked to observe the mansion's gardens, the sculptures, the luxury cars, everything that seemed beautiful on the outside but empty on the inside. Something about that place intrigued him, as if there were a hidden truth behind so much splendor. Rosa, despite spending little time at home, made a point of teaching her son values she believed to be the true treasure: honesty, gratitude, and kindness. She always said that a man's character is not in the clothes he wears, but in the decisions he makes when no one is watching. Gabriel treasured these words as a gift, and it was this teaching that guided him that night, when the magnate unknowingly placed him before the greatest test of his life. Even though he had almost nothing, Gabriel never stopped believing in goodness. For him, life could be hard, unfair, and full of setbacks, but there was still beauty in small gestures. When someone looked down on him for being poor, he smiled. When he went through hardship, he was grateful for what he still had. This mentality, shaped by his mother's example, made him different. The world saw him as the maid's son, but inside him was the essence of a noble man. And perhaps that was precisely what sparked so much interest in the tycoon, even though he didn't immediately understand it. The contrast between his own coldness and the light of humility emanating from that family made him think about everything he had lost along the way. But for now he only observed, without understanding that he was about to experience one of the most profound revelations of his life. That morning passed silently, but inside the tycoon, something was stirring. The boy's gesture and Rosa's dedication had affected him in a way he didn't want to admit. It was as if suddenly the weight of the marble walls began to bother him, as if every luxury around him became a cruel reminder of his own distance from what was real. However, fear still spoke louder. For years he had grown accustomed to being deceived, always by people who said what he wanted to hear, but acted out of self-interest. Now faced with the purity of that boy, something inside him was pushing him to a new limit. He needed to know if it was true, if honesty still existed in this world, if that seemingly innocent demeanor was real or just another well-acted mask. Thus the plan was born, a test, a trap of the heart disguised as chance. The tycoon decided to put to the test not only the loyalty of the maid's son, but also the very faith he insisted on forgetting. That night, the mansion seemed to breathe a different air. The yellowish lights of the corridors cast long shadows across the walls, and the ticking of the clock mingled with the distant sound of rain pattering against the windows. The tycoon walked slowly towards his office, his steps heavy but firm. Outwardly he exuded calm and control, as always. Inwardly, his chest burned with tension. He knew what he was about to do, and part of him hated himself for it. But what was one more disappointment to someone who had already collected so many? He sat in his leather armchair, the same one where he used to spend hours reflecting on business and numbers, and took a deep breath. There, among finely covered books and the smell of tobacco in the air, he began to assemble his test. He opened his wallet and deliberately placed it on the table, in plain sight, full of bills. Then he relaxed his body, leaned back slowly, and closed his eyes. He would pretend to sleep. Not from tiredness, but from skepticism, a kind of challenge to fate. As silence filled the room, thoughts mingled with his anxiety. Is it possible that someone is still incapable of betraying for money? He wondered. Each breath was a mixture of doubt and hope. Each tick of the clock seemed to remind him of the loneliness disguised as pride that kept him impenetrable. He wanted to believe, but he feared being disappointed again. Outside, Rosa finished her last chores, and Gabriel, her son, waited for his mother as he did every day. But that night, she asked for something different. She handed him a glass of water and asked him to take it to his boss's office, who was about to go to sleep. A simple gesture. But for the tycoon, that simple gesture would be the beginning of the revelation. The boy knocked lightly on the door. He heard no answer. He entered carefully. The light from the lamp illuminated the room with a soft, almost melancholic tone. The magnate seemed asleep, and on the table, the open wallet gleamed discreetly under the reflection of the lamp. Gabriel approached, curious but respectful. He placed the glass beside him, trying to make as little noise as possible. At that moment, the tycoon, his eyes half closed, observed. Time seemed to slow down. The sound of his heart pounded in his chest, but he remained motionless, interpreting his own emotional game. For a moment, he wondered who was really being tested there, the boy or himself, because, under those circumstances, the hidden truth was already beginning to emerge. Testing the purity of others often exposes the rot of one's own fears. Gabriel looked at the wallet. There was something almost painful about that sight. The money, carelessly piled up, had the power to poke at wounds that time hadn't yet healed. The nights of hunger, the reused clothes, his mother's tired gaze. He only needed to reach out and touch that symbol of abundance, and perhaps the difficulties would end for a while. But the boy didn't move a finger. Instead, he took a deep breath and gave a half smile. At that moment, he seemed to be conversing with his own conscience. The tycoon observed every gesture, and the more time passed, the more his unease grew. Every second he expected a different decision, a slip that would confirm his bitter beliefs about the world. But something disconcerted him. The boy showed no hesitation out of weakness, but serenity born of conviction. He moved with grace like someone who had learned to live with little, but to think big. The tension in the air was almost palpable. The clock ticked away as if etching each of the magnate's doubts into the walls of the room. Outside, the rain intensified, creating a melancholic backdrop. Inside, the silence was deafening. Gabriel moved a little closer to the table, just to adjust the glass he had brought. Then he covered the magnate with the cloth that lay on the back of the armchair. That was enough. The simple gesture broke through an invisible barrier. The tycoon felt the light touch of the fabric on his shoulders, and for a moment wanted to open his eyes. He wanted to thank her, perhaps even ask forgiveness for having doubted, but he remained paralyzed. His pride still prevented him from surrendering his own vulnerability. The boy then spotted the wallet, and without a second thought carefully closed it. He picked up the wallet and put it back in the desk drawer. Then he took a small piece of paper from his pocket, an old notebook where he used to jot down thoughts, and wrote a few quick words, almost whispering, "What is yours should be safe with you. Wealth fades, but respect remains." He folded the paper delicately, left it on the table and went away, closing the door silently. When the sound of the boy's footsteps faded down the hallway, the tycoon could no longer contain his emotion. He opened his eyes, still feigning calm, but inside, a whirlwind was brewing. It was as if every hardened belief was beginning to slowly crumble. That boy, who had nothing, had just given him the greatest lesson of his life. And as tears threatened to escape, he realized something essential. The real test was never about the boy nor about the money. It was about what remained within him, the very need to believe again. The wealth that had protected him so much now seemed a burden, and pride a prison. The clock continued ticking, indifferent to what was happening inside that room. Outside, the storm had ceased, and a smell of wet earth filled the air, symbolizing something new, the harbinger of a transformation that the tycoon was not yet able to comprehend, but which had already begun. The silence inside the office was almost absolute. Only the insistent ticking of the clock marked the passage of time, slow and dense, as if each second carried a decision about to change destinies. Gabriel stood motionless for a moment, observing the sleeping man and the open wallet on the table. The sound of the rain outside came as a distant comfort, but inside the boy felt the echo of an invisible battle. It was a mixture of fear and doubt, that fine line between the screaming need and the conscience that tries to keep him standing. He approached, and each step seemed heavier than the last. His heart raced, beating to the rhythm of a secret. The glint of the banknotes blinded him for a second, not because of their value, but because of what that money represented. With it, he could buy a new pair of boots for his mother, medicine, perhaps even a better meal. A quick gesture would be all it took, and everything would be resolved. But at the same time, something inside him trembled. His mother's voice, soft and firm, echoing in his memory. "What belongs to others will never make you happy, my son. True blessing comes from honesty." The memory flashed through him like a glimmer of light in the shadows, and it was then that the true weight of temptation revealed itself. His hand even moved instinctively, not to grab the money, but to push away the thoughts that surrounded him. In that brief instant, an old feeling of shame overwhelmed him. He felt shame not for being poor, but for having desired, even if only for a second, what never belonged to him. It was an old wound, the wound of scarcity, which teaches the mind to desire what the heart rejects. Outside, the wind blew strongly, making the curtains vibrate gently. The boy took a deep breath. The air felt heavy, as if the entire room were watching him. The tycoon remained motionless, his face serene, oblivious to the storm raging just a few meters away. But in truth, he felt everything. Behind the appearance of rest, his senses were heightened. The sound of footsteps, the rhythm of the boy's breathing, even the slight creaking of the wood under the weight of his hesitation. Every detail was absorbed with almost painful intensity. Gabriel closed his eyes for a moment, trying to find an answer within himself. What would he do? How could he resist temptation when the cold poverty still burned in his memory? He remembered the nights without dinner, his mother's tired gaze returning late from work, the times he pretended not to be hungry, just so she would eat another piece of bread. All of this seemed to push him forward, and at the same time hold him back. It was a war between instinct and teaching. One wrong move could destroy everything his mother built with so much sacrifice. This phrase surged in his mind like a warning. He felt it, almost heard its voice, as if Rosa were right there beside him, watching. Opening his eyes again, the boy stared at the wallet, and in the reflection of the metal desk, he saw himself. Not the maid's son, but the man who could choose who he would be from then on. That was the silent turning point. He didn't need to take the money to be tempted. The temptation wasn't in the banknotes, but in the memories, the wounds, the exhaustion. The real test wasn't resisting the robbery, but overcoming despair, and Gabriel knew that. Without haste, he took another deep breath, feeling the warm touch of the cloth covering the tycoon. Then he acted. With firm but respectful hands, she took the wallet and carefully placed it in the drawer. The gesture was natural, light, almost instinctive, like restoring balance to the world. Then, without quite knowing why, she adjusted the blanket over the man's shoulders and observed his face for a few seconds. She had never seen him look so human. There was a hidden weariness there, the kind of weariness that doesn't come from work, but from the soul. Gabriel felt a pang of empathy. In his simple way, he understood that this powerful man also carried pain. Perhaps it was an old loneliness, perhaps just the weight of a life surrounded by distrust. And this realization touched him deeply. There was no more fear, only a strange feeling of tenderness, as if, at that moment, poverty and wealth had ceased to be opposites. They were both just two human beings trying to survive their own loneliness. The clock struck a new hour, and the boy realized it was already late. He needed to leave before his mother worried. He took a small piece of paper he always carried in his pocket. It was from an old notebook where he wrote phrases and thoughts. With a pen borrowed from his boss, he wrote down the words that sprang from his heart. A man's worth lies in the choices he makes when he is alone. He folded the note and left it on the table, near the now-closed drawer where his wallet rested. Before leaving, he glanced at the tycoon one last time. That look held a strange affection, the kind of respect that can't be explained, only felt. Then he walked slowly to the door, and when the sound of the latch echoed, it was as if the tension inside the room also dissipated. The tycoon kept his eyes closed, but something inside him had changed. He didn't get up immediately. He preferred to stay there, feeling the newly created silence. His breathing was shaky, and his hands, hidden under the fabric, held a different kind of pain, the pain of someone who realizes they are still capable of feeling. Inside, he fought against the emotion that overwhelmed him almost violently. It was shame, it was relief, it was something he couldn't name. For a few minutes, he remained quiet, listening to the noises of the house and trying to understand what had just happened. The boy had resisted, and more than that, he had demonstrated a greatness that he himself, with all the world's possessions, no longer knew if he possessed. The weight of regret came like a tide. It was impossible to deny. However much he tried to protect himself from life, he had lost something essential in the process, the purity that dwells in souls that refuse to be corrupted. At that moment, the tycoon understood that the test he had devised was not an act of wisdom but of desperation. He wanted to believe, yes, but he was so afraid of being disappointed again that he transformed faith into distrust. He was testing others when, in truth, it was he who needed to prove to himself that there was still light within his own heart. Outside, the sound of the rain subsided, and a cool breeze entered the room. The tycoon opened his eyes. The lamp's light flickered softly, and on the table the small piece of paper left by Gabriel seemed to gleam. With trembling fingers he picked it up, read the words, and for the first time in many years, smiled without commercial motive, without calculation, without armor. It was a human smile, full of truth and regret. The clock's ticking faded back into the background, and that morning the most powerful man in the city understood something that no amount of money could buy. The honesty of those who have little is worth more than the imposed respect of those who have everything. Write this down. I'm on this journey too. The clock struck just after midnight when silence enveloped the entire house. The tycoon still pretended to sleep, his body motionless and his mind awake, a prisoner of an anxiety that left him breathless. He didn't know what to expect. Inside him, the fear of disappointment waged a silent battle against the hope that stubbornly resisted. And then it happened. The simple, the unexpected, the gesture that would change everything without needing words. Gabriel took another step toward the tycoon and noticed the man was trembling slightly, perhaps from the cold emanating from the half-open windows. For a moment, the boy hesitated. He looked around, searching for something he could do, and spotted a folded blanket on a nearby sofa. He picked it up slowly with restrained movements so as not to make a sound. That soft, expensive fabric seemed to belong to another world, a world he would never have access to. Still, without thinking about the contrast between that wealth and his own simplicity, he gently placed it over the tycoon's shoulders, the kind of care that only comes from those who have learned to love the small things in life. It was a simple gesture, but it revealed an immense soul. A gentle smile formed on Gabriel's lips. It wasn't pride, it was relief, the feeling of having done what was right without needing an audience. He stepped back a little, observing the man who had hired him, now better protected from the cold. And there, in that brief instant, something imperceptible happened. The distance between the powerful boss and the maid's son seemed to disappear. There was no wealth, no poverty, only two human beings connected by an act of kindness. With a serene heart, the boy walked to the table and noticed the open wallet again. It was heavy, bulky, almost symbolic, a reminder of the chasm that separated their realities. Touching it would mean crossing an invisible line between need and dignity. But he had no doubts. Naturally, as if fulfilling a simple task, he closed the wallet and put it away in the drawer with the same care his mother used to keep the little they had at home. Still, a thought crossed his mind. What if the tycoon woke up and thought he was stealing? Fear coursed through him, cold as ice. The shame of being judged unfairly was almost as painful as the hunger of those hard days. He swallowed hard, but kept his eyes steady. He knew that truth has a power of its own, and those who act with purity don't need to explain their actions. They only need to stand by them with a clear conscience. Before leaving, he decided to leave something behind, a simple but sincere sign, capable of speaking for him. He reached into his pocket for the same piece of paper he had used before to jot down stray thoughts, phrases that came to mind in moments of longing or hope. He folded it on the table and in calm handwriting wrote, "He who lives honestly sleeps in peace." As he wrote, he remembered his mother and the times he had seen her exhausted, tending to small things with the same zeal one has for a treasure. Rosa always said that life can take almost everything from a person, except their character. And in that exact second, Gabriel understood the true weight of her words. What defines a human being is not what they possess, but what they choose to preserve within themselves. The tycoon, still motionless, felt the paper glide lightly across the table. Even with his eyes closed, he could perceive every movement, every subtle sound. The boy's breathing, the sound of receding footsteps, the soft closing of the door. Everything was imprinted on him like a silent melody, a reminder that purity can dwell even in the most unlikely places. As soon as the boy left, the silence returned, different, full of meaning. The tycoon opened his eyes slowly, as if waking from a dream. For a few seconds he stared at the ceiling, trying to understand what he felt. There was a mixture of surprise and shame, but also a peace he hadn't experienced in a long time. He stood up slowly and walked to the table. The note was there, discreet, like a mirror reflecting something he had forgotten, humanity. As he read the words, he felt a lump in his throat. The world he had built was made of high walls, cold business dealings, contracts, and appearances. He never imagined that the most valuable lesson of his life would come from such an unassuming gesture. He who lives honestly sleeps in peace. The phrase echoed within him, breaking down old barriers, dissolving a pride that had accompanied him for years. The tycoon sat down again, staring intently at the note between his fingers. Memories began to flood his mind, of when he was young and believed in people, of when his father had taught him that being fair was more important than being rich. But time and betrayals had transformed that ideal into distrust. And now that boy, that simple son of the maid, had reminded him that trust is not born of status, but of sincere gestures. Emotion overwhelmed him silently. He was no longer the man who controlled everything. He was simply someone who had rediscovered his own vulnerability. He felt tears slowly streaming down his face, and it was in that instant that he understood that perhaps true transformation lies not in grand actions, but in small gestures that can pierce even the most closed heart. Time seemed to stand still there. No clock, no deal, no fortune had as much value as the scene he had just witnessed. The boy's action made him see the hidden truth behind the loneliness he carried. He didn't need more power, but more humanity. What he had tried to test on others was precisely what was lacking within himself. Behind the scenes of that luxurious room, something profound was happening. The once cold man felt a lightness he hadn't known for decades. The weight of years of distrust was beginning to dissolve, giving way to a silent, almost childlike hope. He held the note, folded it carefully, and tucked it into his wallet, like someone protecting a rare jewel. For a moment, he looked at the ceiling and let out a short, almost shy laugh. It was as if he finally understood how much he had lost, trying to control the world while neglecting to look inward. The impact of that gesture continued to grow within him, touching layers he didn't even know existed. The rain had stopped, and for the first time in a long time, the house seemed alive. Not because of the echoes of luxury, but because of the invisible presence of a kindness that still permeated the air. The tycoon took a deep breath and stood up. He had the feeling that nothing would be the same after that night. A pure-hearted boy had just shown him that greatness lies not in testing people, but in recognizing the value of simple truths. The morning sun streamed through the living room curtains, casting streaks of golden light across the marble floor. The tycoon was still there, seated at the table, holding the small note between his fingers. He had spent the night awake, reliving every gesture of the boy, every detail of that simple scene that somehow had transformed him. Inside, something had broken, not from pain, but from understanding. It was as if an old layer made of pride and loneliness was beginning to slowly dissolve. He felt shame, yes, but also a lightness he hadn't experienced in a long time. For years he had grown accustomed to viewing the world from behind an invisible wall, believing that no one was trustworthy. Now, everything seemed different. That boy, the son of the woman who worked in his house, had done more for him than all his great advisors and business friends combined. Without saying much, the boy had given him the thing he lacked most: humanity. The tycoon rose from his armchair and walked to the window. Outside, the city was beginning to awaken, with its routine sounds, hurried footsteps, voices and horns. He observed the movement with a distant gaze. How many times had he seen that same landscape without truly seeing it? How many opportunities to be kind had been lost amidst the coldness of commitments and haste? Life, he thought, is made of small decisions, and it is these that reveal what is true within us. Later, when he heard the sound of Rosa's footsteps on the stairs, he took a deep breath. He knew what he needed to do. The pride that had been his shield for so long now seemed like a burden. That woman had served his home for years, with dignity and silence, and he had never truly given her a human look. Now, he saw in her the reflection of someone who had courageously sustained her own world. He called her into the room. Rosa entered with her usual respectful gaze, wary of the sudden formality. The boss seemed different, his eyes moist, his voice serene, lacking his previous authoritarian tone. He approached slowly, holding the note the boy had left on the table, and extended it toward her. Rosa read the words and shuddered. She recognized her son's handwriting. For a moment, fear coursed through her body, imagining the worst, believing that something terrible had happened. Before she could ask anything, the tycoon interrupted her with a gentle gesture. He told her everything. He confessed to the test, the distrust, the trap. The words came out with difficulty, because each sentence carried with it a piece of his own regret. He spoke of his desire to believe in people, but of the fear that always held him back. And in the midst of that confession, his voice faltered. "I needed to see with my own eyes that true goodness still exists," she said, her voice breaking. "And your son showed me that." Rosa remained silent. Tears began to flow, first discreetly, then inevitably. Not from resentment, but from relief, because for the first time someone saw the value that she and her son had always carried, the value of simple honesty, of unwavering faith in good. That man, who for so long represented distance and coldness, now opened up before her as an ordinary human being in need of forgiveness. Minutes later, they called the boy. Gabriel arrived without knowing why. He had the same serene expression as always, unaware of the power of his action. The magnate turned around, and upon seeing him was overcome with uncontrollable emotion. Words escaped him for a few seconds. He simply looked at him with the kind of recognition that transcends social differences. "Gabriel," he began, trying to hold back tears, "I owe you much more than you can imagine." The silence that followed was heavy, but also full of meaning. The tycoon explained everything, without hiding his shame. He recounted that he had set up a test, that he had pretended to be asleep, that he had deliberately left the money visible. He expected the worst, but found something so pure, so unexpected, that it completely disarmed him. He said that the words on the note echoed within him throughout the night, and that for the first time in decades, he slept peacefully. The boy listened attentively, without interrupting. At first, a shadow of surprise crossed his face, perhaps even a touch of disappointment, but it soon gave way to a sweet, almost understanding look. He didn't judge him. He understood that each person carries their own wounds, and that the fear of disappointment often steals the place of hope. "You don't need to apologize," Gabriel said calmly. "Sometimes life makes us doubt what is good, but the good remains, even when we forget it." Those words, so simple, struck the tycoon like an arrow. He could barely respond. He took a step forward and impulsively embraced the boy, a gesture he would never have made before. The tears, which had previously represented regret, now came laden with something new, gratitude. That boy gave the tycoon back something that money could never buy: faith in people. The embrace lasted exactly the time it takes for a healing session. Rosa, moved, watched the scene with trembling hands, understanding that this moment symbolized more than forgiveness. It was the beginning of a real change, one of those that are born deep within the soul and are reflected in every choice that follows. The tycoon stepped back slightly, took a deep breath, and looked at Gabriel again. There was a different light in his eyes, the gleam of someone who had finally found meaning in what he had long since lost. He promised himself, without needing to say it aloud, that he would never again let distrust guide him, that he would care for that family with the respect they had always deserved, not out of moral obligation, but out of human recognition. The air in the room felt different. The heavy atmosphere that had previously dominated the place had transformed into something light, almost sacred. For a moment it seemed that all the old pains, disappointments, and years of isolation had been left behind. The tycoon felt the urge to start over, not as the powerful and untouchable man he had always been, but as someone willing to learn, to repair, to live truthfully. As Rosa and her son left the room, the tycoon stood there, looking at the note on the table one last time. He ran his fingers over the words, as if engraving an eternal memory upon them, and smiled. The morning light was already spreading through the hallways, bringing with it the distant sound of the first birds of the day. That house, which for so long had been a temple of silence and coldness, now seemed to breathe hope, and the man who had once lived amidst riches and mistrust was finally discovering the rarest wealth of all, the ability to feel again. That encounter changed everything. The tycoon spent the rest of the day in silence, observing every corner of the house as if seeing it for the first time. The distant sound of footsteps, the aroma of breakfast prepared by Rosa, Gabriel's restrained laughter as he talked to his mother, everything seemed imbued with a new meaning. It was as if time, once so arid and endless, had begun to flow gently again. Something within him was reconfiguring itself, a kind of discreet but profound rebirth. It wasn't just gratitude, it was the feeling that his heart, dormant for so long, had finally awakened. For years he believed that power and money were the only forms of protection against pain. He learned to breathe through control, to find security in figures, to confuse distance with respect. But now, as he observed that simple home forming within his own mansion, he understood that he had lived deceived. The truth hidden behind his cold, imposing demeanor was fear. Fear of feeling, of trusting, of allowing himself to simply be human. And, ironically, it was a barefoot boy with pure hands who freed him from this invisible prison. As I walked through the corridors, I thought about how impatient the world had become. People rush so much in pursuit of something grand that they forget the value of the small things. Haste consumes gestures of kindness, ego erases traces of compassion, and distrust spreads like fog. We live in times where the glitter of appearances seduces more than the light of honesty. And yet, it is in simple gestures, so simple, that true greatness is revealed. The tycoon reflected on those he had lost along the way, the friends who drifted away when success reached its peak, the family members who couldn't bear the weight of his arrogance, the love that left when pride prevailed. All those achievements now seemed small compared to what he had rediscovered, the power of being true to himself. He realized that honesty is not just a moral virtue, but a form of freedom. Those who live truthfully do not fear being seen. Those who act with purity sleep peacefully. The impact of that night continued to grow within him. Each memory came with a revelation, as if life insisted on showing him how much he had wasted trying to prove something to the world, while failing to prove something to himself. The power he valued so much now seemed fragile. For the first time, he honestly asked himself, what good is being admired by many when you are incapable of being respected by those who truly matter? Rosa and Gabriel continued working at the mansion, but everything had changed. The once heavy and distant atmosphere now breathed humanity. The magnate began to truly listen to what they had to say. Sometimes I would call them for coffee, just to chat. He learned the taste of simple dialogue, of stories told without pretension, of the serenity that arises when one recognizes the value of another. And, little by little, that transformation extended beyond the walls of his home. The man who once gave orders began to ask questions. The tough businessman started to observe. Business decisions now came with a new mindset, that there is no lasting success if it is not built on integrity. It was as if the test that night had changed his way of seeing the world. Gabriel's note, kept inside his wallet, had become a lucky charm. Every time I touched it, I remembered where the peace I felt now came from. But more than outward actions, the greatest journey was taking place within him. With each sunrise, the tycoon tried to be a little more true to himself. He acknowledged his flaws, faced his own fears, and began to see that pride is merely a disguise for insecurity. Accepting this didn't diminish him. It made him more human, and that was his greatest victory. One afternoon, while watching Gabriel tending to the garden plants, he noticed something curious. The boy was whistling an old song while calmly watering the flowers, as if the world belonged to him at that moment. There was a lightness in that gesture that the tycoon envied for a moment. That was the peace that money never brought him, the contentment of someone who lives in harmony with their own heart. It was then that he understood what it truly means to be rich. It's not about possessing much, it's about needing little. And that's precisely where the value of honesty lies. It's not a virtue to be displayed, but a silent form of greatness. It's what distinguishes those who live by appearances from those who live with purpose. In a time when everything seems negotiable, love, trust, one's word, honesty remains the foundation that sustains what is priceless, because what defines a person is not what they possess, but what they do when no one is watching. The tycoon looked at the sky that late afternoon and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: true peace. Not the peace bought with comfort, but the peace that springs from the serenity of being at peace with oneself. And he thought of the boy, the woman who had raised him, and everything he had lost believing that the world was too cruel to deserve kindness. Now he knew. Kindness does exist, but it often disguises itself as humility. Sometimes it is poor on the outside and immensely rich on the inside. The man's transformation wasn't spectacular. It was silent, like a flame slowly rekindling within a weary heart. And in the end, he was no longer the same. He realized that life has a curious way of teaching. First it hurts us, then it heals us, and only then does it reveal the hidden purpose behind the pain. That boy had become the mirror of what he had always wanted to be, someone capable of doing the right thing even when no one is watching. Gabriel's victory was internal, and the tycoon's recognition was his liberation. In a world that races to find everything, they found the essential, the truth. If you've made it this far, it's because this story resonated with something inside you, perhaps that part that still believes in people, even when the world seems to doubt. And that's why it's worth continuing this journey together. Here, each video is more than a narrative. It's an invitation to reflect, feel, and see the beauty that still exists in simple truths. So if this content resonated with you, if it touched your heart in any way, leave a like below, not as an obligation, but as a way to show that stories like this still have a place, that they still make a difference. And if you want to continue following these messages that inspire and bring out the best in us, subscribe to the channel. That's what keeps this journey alive, and it's your support that makes all this work worthwhile. Oh, and tell me in the comments, right? I'm with you until the end. I want to know who was there for this story until the very last second. There's a video over here that complements this reflection. Go check it out and continue reading. The next story will also move you.